Well, welcome to the Silent Wings Museum and to Columbia 15 years after. My name is Monty Monroe. I am the archivist of the Southwest Collection at Texas Tech University, and it is my great privilege to be the MC for these proceedings here today. And a little bit later, we will be introducing our special guest speaker. You're not going to have to put up with me too much longer. But before I introduce Colonel Steve and Lindsey, please allow me to make some statements of appreciation to some of the people that made this wonderful exhibit possible out here today. First, and most importantly, we want to thank the families of Willie McCool and Rick Husband, particularly Mrs. Lani McCool, Willie's widow, donated and loaned some very unique materials in there that have never been seen and will not be seen by anybody else except all of us out here in West Texas. So we're very thankful to Lani. Also, Mrs. Evelyn Husband Thompson was gracious enough a number of years ago to donate the records of Commander Rick Husband to the Southwest Collection at Texas Tech University. And so many of those items are here, along with some others that have come to us in the intervening years. Also, I'd like to thank Colonel Audrey and Professor Barry McCool, who are in the audience here, and I think they're spread out and hiding at this moment. But they, of course, have been neck deep in this whole process from the very beginning, making things available, and they work with us at the Southwest Collection here at the Silent Wings Museum and the Texas Aviation Heritage Foundation all the time. So this exhibit would not exist without these people and their generosity in making these unique personal materials available. Also, what we'd like to do is thank the Helen Jones Foundation, who also helped with the making the exhibit possible, and most importantly, for bringing our special guest speaker to us today. I'd also like to thank, if you just give me a minute, a couple of the people from the Southwest Collection and the Silent Wings Museum curatorial staffs who, of course, brought all the materials together and curated the exhibit and made it happen. First and foremost, I'll start with my unit, the Southwest Collection, and I'd like to thank especially John Perrin and Robert Weaver. I think Robert's here tonight. Of course, our director, Jennifer Spurrier, and some of the other people, Sarah Stevenson in our building, who moved all these materials many times, and they got them over here for the Silent Wings folks to put their things together. And having said that, I want to thank especially the curatorial staff at the Silent Wings Museum, especially Eddie Grigsby. Eddie, where are you at? Back over in the back over there. And of course, his cohort in crime, Sharon McCullough, and I don't know where Sharon is. I've yet to see. There you are, back over in the back. Please give these people a round of applause. They worked very hard to put this together. I'd also like to thank from the city of Lubbock, Brooke Witcher, who, of course, oversees the Silent Wings Museum and the Buddy Holly Museum and other heritage entities here in the city. And Brooke does a lot behind the scenes to make things happen. And I'd also like to thank some of our media personnel from both the Southwest Collection, Texas Tech Libraries, as well as the city of Lubbock and the Silent Wings Museum. Particularly, I'd like to thank Glennis Young from Texas Tech University, along with Kaylee Daniel, Texas Tech Libraries, Brianna Vella. Brianna, where were you at? I just saw you a little bit earlier back there in the back. She sent out some wonderful press releases as well. And all these people helped to get the word out. We really appreciate the local media who stepped up to let people know. We even have people here from Muleshoe tonight. So science teachers from Muleshoe we're very pleased to have. So with that being said, please let me just move ahead to the introduction of our guest speaker tonight. It is a privilege this evening to introduce you to one of those remarkable human beings that the author Tom Wolfe said have the right stuff. Now, this particular individual would just say that he's just another person doing his duty. but many of us know better. Colonel Stephen Lindsey was commissioned as a second lieutenant at the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1982. And in 1983, he was right out here in Lubbock, Texas, receiving his pilot's wings at Reese Air Force Base. So we kind of claim him as one of our own as well, Steve. While he was doing that, his wife Diane was working at one of the local hospitals here as a nurse. She has gone on to become an engineer, an electrical engineer, but she started her career out here in their marriage in Lubbock as a nurse. After his training, he qualified as a Phantom II aircraft pilot, and he was assigned to the 12th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron. And in 1989, he attended the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base in California. And by 1993, he was selected to attend the Air Command and Staff College. During his career, Colonel Lindsey has logged over 7,000 hours of flying time in more than 50 different types of aircraft. I've had the privilege this week of listening to Steve telling me about some of the different aircraft that he had flown. In March 1995, Colonel Lindsey was selected as a NASA astronaut candidate, becoming an astronaut about a year later after his training. He qualified as a shuttle pilot, and among his duties with NASA, he worked on flight software, shuttle avionics, multifunction electronic display systems, and numerous other upgrade projects. Between his first two flights, he served as the shuttle landing and rollout representative responsible for training flight crews and testing orbiter landing techniques and flying qualities. Following his second flight, he served as the deputy for shuttle operations and co-chairman of the Shuttle Space Cockpit Council, leading to an important shuttle cockpit avionics upgrade. And he was working at that time, I believe, Steve, with our own Willie McCool, was he not? And Steve was telling us at lunch today that actually some of those very upgrades that he and Willie worked on are now about to go into one of the spacecraft that may be going to Mars in the future, right? So Willie's legacy lives on. He ultimately became Chief of International Space Station Operations as the astronaut officer in the astronaut office, and his last assignment was as Chief of Astronaut Corps, especially during the Space Shuttle Columbia mishap. He was responsible for spacecraft development, crew selection and training, and other duties in support of the Space Shuttle, International Space Station, and Constellation programs. Colonel Lindsey was a veteran of 5 space flights, logging more than 1,500 hours in outer space. And I must tell you this, I had the privilege of meeting him at the Kennedy Space Center 2 years ago at the Fallen Heroes exhibit that was opened in the new Space Shuttle museum there at the Kennedy Space Center. I saw a personal side of Colonel Lindsey that I think you should all know about. That night, I saw him go over and sit by the children of Commander Rick Husband. He was acting like a good father and asking questions and making sure that they were feeling comfortable that night. And I've seen those very same qualities this week when I've had the great honor of driving him around being his chauffeur. He is a very humble man. He's a most excellent human being. He's extremely intelligent, extremely capable. But as he told me on the way over here today, he's just an average guy. I don't believe it for a minute. Please help me welcome Colonel Steve Lindsey.
Thank you, Monty. He promised a short introduction. I don't think that was a short introduction to you. So, about 10% of what he just said is true. So, but you'll have to guess which 10%. So, And to all your kids out there, I really am only an ordinary guy. I just had a lot of opportunities. So anyway, I'm really excited to be here tonight to get a chance to talk to you. Hopefully I won't bore you to death, but I want to share a few things with you. You know, first of all, as Monty mentioned, you know, I got my start in the Air Force after graduating from the academy right here. And I told the folks at lunch today, you know, whoever built Reese Air Force Base decided to put those runways into a direct crosswind, which made it probably one of the most difficult pilot training bases to learn how to fly at was right here. We probably washed out more pilots here than anywhere else. But once you graduate from here, everybody that graduated from here really knew how to fly. And I think my experiences here kind of set me on the path of my future, and I probably wouldn't be standing up here in front of you talking today if I hadn't gone to Reese long ago. So thank you to whoever put those runways in the direct crosswind, and because it was a great place. Met a lot of great people. I'll recognize Mary and Daryl Vines. You guys stand up. Where are you? Right here. So these two people, so Daryl was a double E professor and Mary, and they were here when I was a student. And what they did was the community sponsored young budding pilots and their families, and they were our sponsors, and invited us to their house, invited us to their church, gave us kind of a community and a family to plug into, and we've maintained our relationship all these years. And there are a lot of people that kind of guide you in your life, and I consider both of them mentors, both my wife and I do, in our lives, and really made a difference when we needed somebody to make a difference. So thank you for that. So I want to switch gears, though. You know, today is the 15th anniversary of the Columbia accident, and I think, as everybody knows, Rick Husband went to Texas Tech here, grew up in Amarillo. Of course, Willie McCool graduated from high school here, so there's a lot of strong Lubbock connections into that crew. So 15 years ago today, I want to tell you a little bit about what I was doing, and then I want to talk about the crew, because I think it's important for those of you. How many of you knew Rick or Willie? Anybody in here? Just a couple of people. I want to relate my experiences of that crew, because I think it's important we remember, you know, who they are and what they accomplished. But so 15 years ago, on that day, I was with the families. I was, for every crew that flies a shuttle mission, the crew will pick a couple of family escorts that are other astronauts, and your job as a family escort is to take the families down to the launch, take them down to the landing during the mission. You act as liaison between the mission and what's going on with NASA and them. You take care of their kids. You get them to video conferences with their families and do all that kind of stuff. And I was selected as, they selected me as family escort for that mission. So that day, that morning, 15 years ago, I was standing by the runway with the families, waiting for Columbia to return. And of course, Columbia never did return, and we lost the crew that day. And so there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about that crew and think about my friends that I lost that day. But I want to talk about them as they lived, not how they died. And that's what I want you to know a little bit about today, and I'll talk about what else, you know, I felt like I needed to do afterwards. So let me go through them really quickly. First of all, Elon Ramon, he was the Israeli astronaut. He and I were real good friends. Our oldest children were in school together. I first met him at a PTA event, believe it or not. He had just arrived at Johnson Space Center, unbeknownst to me, and I was talking to him and introduced myself to him. Obviously, he told me he was from Israel, and I said, well, what are you doing here in Houston? And he said, well, I'm training to be an astronaut. And I looked him right in the eye, and I said, no, you're not. And I said, because I'm an astronaut, and I don't know you, and there's not that many of us. And so, as it turns out, I was wrong. He was right. He was training. None of us knew that they were going to put an Israeli astronaut on this crew. And so, a couple weeks later, it became official, and he joined the crew. But Elon was a great family man. Had a wonderful family. He was a F-16 fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and a hero in Israel long before he ever became an astronaut. For those of you that are old enough to remember, back in 1983, the Iraqis were building a nuclear reactor to make weapons grade, I believe, plutonium to do a weapon. Israel didn't like that much, so they launched a raid and they blew up that reactor. Well, Elon Ramon planned that attack, and he was the last pilot in on that attack. And so he was a hero. That didn't actually come out until after the accident, but he told me about it before they went up on the flight. So he was a hero, a great guy. Dave Brown and Laurel Clark, both in the class right behind mine, 96 class. I was in the 95 class. Dave was the crew photographer. He carried a camera everywhere. There are hundreds of hours of footage of this crew training all over the place. Even on the bus, all the way going up to launch, he was recording. Dave was a flight surgeon turned Navy pilot. He did both. He was a very versatile guy, great guy. Laurel and her sweet little son. She was also a Navy doctor, very accomplished lady. And they were both just had the greatest. Every one of this crew were the most humble and nicest people, the people you want to live next door to, and that's who they were. Kalpana Chawla, she was from India. She was one of the mission specialists. Kalpana was in my astronaut class. I actually flew my first flight with Kalpana. We called her KC because nobody could pronounce Kalpana. And she was full of life. She was an avid pilot. She flew all the time. She had little airplanes with all her pilot's licenses. She was interesting about Kalpana. She grew up in India. She came to this country, became a U.S. citizen, got a couple of advanced degrees here, and then became an astronaut. But in those days, a woman in India going to do what she did was very, very unusual, and she broke the mold in India. She was kind of considered an outcast because of what she did. But I can tell you her parents were very proud of her, and she was a terrific lady to fly with, a great friend of mine, and very, very capable. She could think circles around me. Of course, that's not very hard to do. Pretty much everybody can do that. So Mike Anderson, also in my class, he was an Air Force pilot, and Mike was a terrific guy. Actually, he and Rick Husband and I were all created a Bible study when we were going through astronaut training together. So Mike was a great friend of mine, a very accomplished Air Force pilot with a sweet family. And then finally, Willie and Rick. So Willie was in the class right behind me, and Willie was probably the smartest guy I've ever met. And I mean that sincerely. He was absolutely brilliant. He and I worked together for 2 years. We were given the task I was given the task to redesign the space shuttle cockpit and all its displays. Willie came on board, and he led the trajectory, the guidance, navigation, and control portion of that. And he created new displays, created new ways of thinking about all of the data. It's a very complex thing to fly in and out of orbit. But he redesigned all of those to make them more intuitive, and his designs actually ended up on the space shuttle in later software versions long after the Columbia accident, and the root of his designs are on the Orion spacecraft, which is designed to go to the moon that Monty mentioned here in the beginning. Brilliant guy, full of life, humble, but full of life with a sweet family, and he was one of my best friends in that office, and he was just a super guy. Again, could think circles around me, but this is the common theme. Everybody can think circles around me. And finally, Rick Husband. Rick was probably my best friend in the astronaut office. Rick and I had similar careers. We both started in F4s, and we were both test pilots. He was actually test pilot at Edwards. I was a test pilot out in Florida. He was the first person in my class I met when he came into Houston. So a quick story about Rick that some of you, probably nobody's ever heard. So both Rick and I had old Camaros. I had like an 81 Camaro. He had a 75 Camaro. And, so these things were old. Mine was 15 years old by the time we got to NASA. And he had one. Well, as you might imagine, our cars were always breaking down. And so one day we were still living in apartments. We both just started training. And his Camaro, he had a 75 Camaro, and it broke. He had it in the shop, wouldn't run. So he asked me if I'd give him a ride to work. I said, yeah, sure, I'll give you a ride to work. However, I got to warn you, we'd had a whole bunch of rains. And I had old T-tops. You guys remember old T-tops on a Camaro? And my T-tops leaked like a sieve. I mean, it was really bad. Literally, it leaked so bad, and there was so much rain that I would go out in the morning during all these rainstorms with a bucket and bail out the wheel wells in the back seat. It was bad. So I told Rick, I said, okay, I'm going to give you a ride to work, but I'm warning you, every time we come to a stop in this car, pick your feet up, because what's going to happen is all that water is going to rush forward, and it's gonna soak your feet. And if you don't pick your feet up, you're gonna completely soak your feet in your socks. And it was kind of a cold day, and it was in winter. And, well, so he said, yeah, I can handle that. Well, he couldn't. So we came to a stop going into work, and it was only like 3 miles to work, but one of the stops, he forgot to pick his feet up. All that water came rushing forward and trashed his feet and his pants, and so he came walking into work with me, slosh, 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 and although I made sure that every single astronaut in that office knew what he had done. But Rick was probably about the funniest guy I ever knew. He was hilarious. He did family escort for me, just like I had done for them on that day, on several of my flights. And my kids would rather sit in the bus and listen to stories from him than to go visit me when I was in quarantine. And they told me that. So they give you an idea what kind of guy he was. But a terrific guy, exceptional pilot, just brilliant. So before I move on, I do have a couple of statements I want to read since we are remembering them today. And the first one I have is from Barry and Audrey for Willie, and it's a statement on behalf of the McCool family. We would, first of all, on behalf of the whole McCool family, like to thank the Lubbock community for their support and the many tributes to Willie that are throughout the city. While he would be embarrassed by all the attention he has received through these tributes, we hope that they are a positive reminder that anyone, even the most ordinary person, can achieve the extraordinary through perseverance in maintaining focus on his or her dreams. All of the Columbia crew, like Willie, were just ordinary folks who followed a path that led them to accomplish extraordinary achievements, particularly while being the cohesive crew that took Columbia into space. We believe that Willie would be especially pleased if he knew that he might be a role model for many of today's young people, a role model that could motivate them to gain an education, to enable them to follow their dreams wherever they may lead. He would also be pleased to have his name associated with the Lubbock area scholarship programs which help young people gain that education. And this is from Evelyn Husband, Rick's widow, who unfortunately could not be here today. Thank you so much for gathering to honor the brave crew of STS-107. I would like to extend my warmest greetings to Willie's parents, Barrett and Audrey. I would also like to say a special hello to Dr. Monty Monroe, who just introduced me with his really short introduction. Dr. Monroe has worked tirelessly and faithfully for years to ensure the important preservation of Rick's personal and professional belongings at the prestigious Southwest Collection at Texas Tech University. Rick and I are both the proud Red Raiders, and it is very fitting for his collection to be archived here. When I was a freshman and Rick was a sophomore at Texas Tech, we went on our very first date on January 28, 1977. Years later, in 1986, the Challenger tragedy occurred on the same day. On January 28, 2003, we had our last conversation with Rick while he was in space. Rick started the conversation with, "Happy dating anniversary," and it came to a close with many "I love you" said back and forth. Several hours later from orbit, Rick gave a beautiful tribute to the Challenger crew. This year marks the 15th anniversary of the Columbia tragedy. We remember them with a mixture of sorrow and much pride. I really like a quote from Pastor Chuck Swindoll that states, "We are all faced with a series of great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as impossible situations." With what initially seemed impossible 15 years ago, there have been great opportunities in our lives personally as well as professionally. We all have privately dealt with our loss and grief and continue to do so. It is inspiring to witness the strength of the families and their friends to persevere in life and look for redeeming value in our loved ones' lives and their commitment to mankind. Their goals have become our goals. We are grateful for the continued support of the NASA family as well as our family and friends with their continued love, support, prayers, and hard work honoring the beloved Columbia crew. So, while we think about them today, we don't want to linger on what necessarily happened 15 years. What we really want to emphasize is their legacy and what's happening today. And so what I thought I'd do for you is I want to talk to you a little bit about what I'm doing now, why I'm doing what I'm doing now, but then I'll take you back to the past at the end, and when you get tired of hearing me talk, when you absolutely can't stand it anymore, then I'm going to show a video so you don't have to hear me talk anymore. So kids, hold on for the video because it's going to be a really cool video of my last space shuttle mission. You get to see us goofing off in space. So bear with me. So let me get this computer running for just a second. Oh, good, I remember the password. All right. Let's see. I'll start here. So, what kid ever wanted to play with a paper capsule? What do you want to play with? Do you want to play with a paper capsule or a paper airplane? Paper airplane. That's the right answer. Me too. So, after the Columbia accident, we, NASA, and us as individuals had to make a decision. What are we going to do? And the nation had to make a decision. What are we going to do with the space shuttle program? Where is space headed? And so we obviously went through the investigation, figured out what was wrong. The president, Bush at the time, made a decision. Okay, let's fly out the space shuttle program, but let's fly it out just till we get space station completed. Once we get the International Space Station built, then we're going to end the space shuttle program, continue the space station program, but then we're going to build a new system where you go explore and go to the moon. That was called the Constellation program. And so we started working on that. It became very quickly pretty obvious that we didn't have the budget to do all of those things. And so when President Obama came in, they reviewed the budget, they concluded, well, we can't afford the Constellation program, and we just built this big space station that we have to operate and get return on. We can't do both. So they canceled that exploration program. And after the Columbia accident, I went and I flew 2 more shuttle missions. I flew a return to flight test mission after Columbia to make sure that we had fixed the tank and done all the things we needed to do to fly safely. And then my last flight, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, I flew the final flight of Discovery in 2011. But I was trying to decide what I wanted to do next. And with the Constellation program canceled, and with us flying to space station on Russian rockets because we didn't have our own, I was very worried that this nation, we would know, when the space station program was finally over, we would have no way to get into space, and our space program would end. And so I thought, well, what could I do to make a difference? I always liked winged vehicles for flying in and out of low Earth orbit, like the space shuttle. There were obviously problems with the space shuttle we had to go solve, but I always believed that that was the right way to do it, particularly in the future if we want to commercialize space. And so about that time, I got called by a company called Sierra Nevada Corporation, which is not the beer company, by the way. Sometimes I wish it was, but it wasn't. But Sierra Nevada Corporation out of Colorado, and they were working on a program called the Dream Chaser, and what it is a little lifting body. And so they asked me, hey, can you come work on this? And so I said, well, I want to see the design. And so I spent 2 days picking the design apart, trying to figure out what was wrong with it. And I couldn't find anything, a few things wrong with it, but nothing serious. And so about 5-6 years ago now, I went to Colorado, and that's what I'm doing now is I'm working on the Dream Chaser program. So what is it? Well, that's what it is. How many of you have heard of this? Any of you heard of this? Okay, a few of you have heard of this. So this is a lifting body spacecraft. This is a mini space shuttle. This is the follow-on to the legacy of the Columbia crew and the legacy of the space shuttle program. And so it's actually designed to carry people or cargo, and it's a lot smaller than the space shuttle. That's how small it is. So what we did is we looked at all of the designs of the space shuttle, all the things we learned over 30 years of operating the space shuttle, and we looked at all of those things that either created safety issues or were really, really expensive to turn around and operate, and we tried to eliminate all those things. A simple example is, when we lost Columbia, it was lost because we had foam that came off the external tank and hit the underside or the leading edge of the orbiter and destroyed part of the heat shield. That's why we lost Columbia. We said, let's prevent debris from hitting the vehicle on ascent. And the easiest way to do that is, how about we put this thing on top of the rocket rather than on the side of the rocket? And so that's a simple example of some of the things we changed. So the vehicle is a lot smaller, so it either carries, instead of carrying crew and a whole bunch of cargo, it just carries either crew generally or cargo. And the space shuttle could carry 7 crew members. How many crew members think we can carry? 7, same number. So it's a pretty capable little vehicle. So where did it come from? All right, this is the spy novel part of the presentation. So if you look at the pictures of the top right on this slide, you see those black and white pictures. That's a vehicle called a Bor 4. And the Soviet Union had tested this Bor 4, and it just come down from space, landed in the water, and a Soviet trawler was picking it up. Well, an Australian P-3 spy plane happened to be flying over that area, coincidentally, took some pictures, and they didn't know what it was. And so they sent these pictures to our CIA, and the CIA in Virginia looked at it, and they looked at the pictures, and they said, well, we don't really know what this is, but we're pretty sure we want one. And so they handed it to NASA. This is all a true story. They handed it to NASA Langley, and NASA Langley took it, and they reverse engineered it, and they created something called the HL-20. They did thousands of wind tunnel tests. They actually built a full-size mock-up that you can see in the museum in Denver if you ever want to go see it. And they concluded this is a really good shape for a lifting body vehicle, lifting body spacecraft, has a lot of great characteristics. And NASA started developing this, and they developed it from about 1983 to 1995. At one time it was going to be a rescue vehicle for the space station, and then it died a political/financial death, like most programs do, and it was put away on the shelf. Well, my boss went about 13 years ago now, and went and talked to the NASA administrator and asked if we could license it, because we wanted to create a commercial vehicle and try to commercialize low Earth orbit. And so that's where the Dream Chaser came from. So we changed the name of the Dream Chaser, but it's based on this Bor 4 and HL-20 heritage. We won a number of NASA contracts to develop the crew version of the vehicle up till about 2014. Then we competed to provide crew services to the International Space Station. Unfortunately, we lost out to a couple of those capsule guys. But then at the same time, we were developing a cargo version to provide supplies back and forth to the space station. We actually won that contract in 2016, so multi-billion-dollar contract where we're going to fly a minimum of 6 missions to the International Space Station. So come fall of 2020, be looking for us, because we'll be flying our first mission to space. So this is what we're building now. It's called the Dream Chaser cargo system. It looks just like the Dream Chaser, difference being it has what's called a cargo module on the back, which allows us to carry more cargo. So we can carry about 5,500 kilograms of supplies and science experiments and stuff like that to the space station, and then we bring back and land on a runway about 2,000 kilograms, which is something that the space shuttle was really good at, but since the space shuttle retired, we haven't been able to do that at all. So we're able to restore a lot of the science capability that NASA needs for the space station, which is quite frankly why they picked us to be part of this program. So that's what I'm working on now. It's keeping me up day and night and stressing me out totally. But anyway, it's really hard to build a spacecraft from scratch. I learned that. So that's what I've learned in the last 6 years. This is our engineering test article. This is an atmospheric test vehicle. It's a real vehicle. And we just flight tested that for the second time last November out at Edwards Air Force Base. We actually released it from a helicopter and flew it down to a runway landing. So I think what I'm going to do right now, if I can call it up, I'm going to show you the video of that flight test, and you can see how this thing flies. Now keep in mind, we're releasing it from a helicopter. The helicopter flies at about 60 knots max speed at the altitude we were at. Our vehicle likes to fly at about 350 miles an hour. And so when we release off the helicopter to get to the right approach speed so that we can get the flight test data that we needed, we actually, you'll see the nose dump over at about a 70-degree dive, screaming at the desert floor to pick up that airspeed before we pull up and pick up that trajectory. So the 60 seconds video I'm going to show you of the flight was the longest 60 seconds of my life. So, so let me call that up and I'll show that to you real quick, if I can find it. Hopefully we have sound.
Great day to fly, huh? You are go for lift, go for lift. guide. Good flight controls.
Copy, good flight control.
8,000 feet.
Copy, 8,000.
Feet.
Copy, 400. Landing gear. Copy, gear deploy.
Good gear deploy. 5 feet. Touchdown.
Let's go ahead and monitor your systems, guys. Monitor your systems.
Wheel stop. Wheel stop.
So, next time you see that fly, hopefully in fall of 2020, look for us. We'll be coming back from orbit. All right. Now I got to figure out how to get out of this. There we go. Okay. So that's the Dream Station. That's what I'm working on now, among several other things. What I want to do now is switch gears for you, and I'm getting to the more interesting part where I'm going to show a space shuttle video, and you don't have to listen to me talk anymore. So let me jump to that. And so as I mentioned, the last flight I flew was the final flight of Discovery, and Discovery is an interesting vehicle because it was after the Columbia. Discovery was the oldest space shuttle vehicle we had. It flew 39 flights, and I flew the 39th and final one. And it was an interesting flight. It had a great crew, and when I was coming in to land, I remember thinking, as soon as I land this, the next stop for this vehicle is going to be the Smithsonian. So if you want to see Discovery, you can go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. That's where it is now. And you can go look at the tires, and you can see the marks I made when I landed. It was a good landing. You'll see it. It was an okay landing, but I still put marks on the tires. Anyway, so let me talk about that a little bit. We were going up to the International Space Station, and I actually took this picture as we were leaving the International Space Station. And so we were actually the last assembly mission of the International Space Station. So we installed the final pressurized module that called Assembly Complete on the Station after working on it for, we started in '98, so 13 years. And we went up there, I had a 6-person crew. We went up there, and it was about a 2-week mission, and we installed something called a PMM, a pressurized multi-purpose module, which was like a large pressurized module that we would use for stowage. We actually used it originally to transport supplies back and forth, but we ended up leaving it on orbit because the crew needed more space, so we re-outfitted and repurposed it. We also put on board what's called an express logistics carrier, which is a big platform carrier that we installed robotically on space station that carries a lot of large spares like pump packages and things like that. If things break outside the vehicle or outside the space station, they go do spacewalks and robotics to repair that. We pre-positioned spares, and with the shuttle program going away, that was really important because we didn't have anything else to haul up these large components for spares, and so we pre-positioned as many spares as we possibly could up there. Again, 13-day mission. I had a great crew, 6-person crew. The old guy there on the right, I guess on the far right side, you know who he is. I was just along trying to keep up with the rest of this crew. Next to me, pilot Eric Bowe. He was an Air Force colonel, also a test pilot, very gifted individual. The crew programs that are going on right now, there's SpaceX and Boeing are building capsules. He's going to be one of the test pilots for one of those first flights, so look for him. You will see him in the news shortly. Next to him, Steve Bowen. He was a Navy officer. He was was on fast attack submarines, and great guy. He was one of our spacewalkers. Eric was the pilot. I was the commander. We were basically both responsible for flying and operating the vehicle. Next to him, Al Drew. He's an Air Force pilot, actually a helicopter pilot, flew special operations in the Air Force. He was our other spacewalker. He was on his second flight. very gifted individual. Next to him, Mike Barrett, a medical doctor who had just done a 6-month long duration flight, very experienced astronaut, great guy. And finally, Nicole Stodd, who had also just come back from a long duration flight. Nicole's from Florida. She was an engineer. She used to do flying a shuttle training aircraft, very involved in aviation, and used to actually run the processing of space shuttles down in Florida. So that was my crew. Wanted a 16-day mission. So without going into too much more, I think what I'd like to do is show you the mission. We did a couple of spacewalks in the mission. You'll get to see all the things we did. It's only about 16 minutes. It's hard to put a 2-week mission into 16 minutes, but hopefully it'll give you some flavor. So before I start, though, a couple caveats. In the beginning of the mission, or in the beginning of the video, you're going to hear, how many of you remember the original Star Trek? Okay, you guys remember the music and remember William Shatner saying space is the final frontier? Well, you're going to hear this on his video, but what he did was, since it was the final flight of Discovery, he decided to do the voiceover, and he, instead of talking about the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, you're going to hear him talking about the voyages of the spaceship Discovery. And then you'll see these patches coming by, and those are the 39 patches of all of the missions that were flown on Discovery. So it's kind of a cool thing he did. It's a little geeky, but if you like Star Trek like me, it's not so geeky. So it all depends on what you like. And then the other point, during one of the spacewalks, you're gonna hear an old Sting song called "Message in the Bottle," at least part of it, and that just references a Japanese experiment we were doing in space that was called "Message in a Bottle." So we're crew members. We're all engineers. We're not that clever creatively. So just bear with me on that one. So let me get the video running, and then I'll step out of the way.
These have been the voyages of the Space Shuttle Discovery. Her 30-year mission, to seek out new science, to build new outposts, to bring nations together on the final frontier, to boldly go and do what no spacecraft has done before.
Discovery to the crew of Discovery. Enjoy the ride. Thanks for all the work you did getting this ready to go, and appreciate all your work. And for those watching, get ready to witness the majesty and the power of Discovery as she lifts off one final time.
We have made it to space. 2, 1, and the final liftoff of Discovery. A tribute to the dedication, hard work, and pride of America's space shuttle team. He just wants to fly. Woman say it's my turn. Step inside. Full burn. Many died in space and time.
Yeah, I was just looking out the window here, going over to the Earth. I'm thinking about how cool it is to be up here doing this. But what's even more impressive to me about the whole spaceflight business is when you have a large team like we have doing something incredibly complex, and yet we pull it off successfully year after year, mission after mission.
One good thing is you can't drop your pencil.
He's obviously a physics major. How faster, Alvin? Come on, Taylor. Go. Okay, we're going to show kind of a flight through. This is starting in the airlock. This control stud up there working to pull out the centerline camera. And Steve Lindsey, pilot Eric Bowe, who the bravest men I know.
We're legends in our own mind.
Legends in their own mind.
Hey Steve, Tim, I just wanted to tell you guys you all had an awesome launch, and we were all very proud of you down here.
Great to hear your voice, Tim. I wish you were here because I send you on the hunt for the overlay that I'm missing. But anyway, appreciate the good words. It was a great launch. Can't tell you how much we wish you were here with us as well.
Well, I'm sure you know that I feel the same way, but I definitely feel like I'm there in spirit, and I'm especially looking forward to seeing Steve and Al go out the door and do great work.
All right, Discovery, just goes to show you have a 7-person crew. They're just not all up there with you.
Absolutely. Well, in Houston, we have a tally going ISS up the front windows. That thing is a lot bigger since the last time I was here. Discovery Station has you loud and clear on the big loop. What took you guys so long? Monocall, initiating RPM. 3, 2, 1, mark. Initiating final approach. Station in Houston, Discovery has capture confirmed.
Hey, all right. Hello.
Hello.
I just wanted to thank Mike for being the voice of DLC Forum here today and let you guys know how much we appreciate your help and that it was really very impressive working from the cupola and watching how these arms work together and getting the EOC birth to the truck.
Well, Discovery is a really historic vehicle in a lot of ways. It took its name from a lot of ships of exploration over many centuries, and it comes with a pretty rich heritage, and it's really lived up to that. She just performed magnificently getting us up here, so I think we're all going to be kind of sad to see it go. And we're going to remember Discovery and all the shuttle fleet, I think, is the most capable vehicles that have ever flown in space. Steve Bowen uncharacteristically speechless, and our commander has given them all sorts of words of encouragement and also told them if they do a bad job, he won't let them back in.
Okay, heads open and stowed. You doing good out there? Just bending and stretching, you're not gonna wake up sometime. That coffee ought to be kicking in any time now. You see the rest of our camera? Excellent, you guys. Let's speed finish up the moving center task and then head back to the airlock, and then we'll be ready for
And to the whole team, great work, including a textbook EVA.
The Alvin Drew, first EVA. What are you going to do, Al?
Gonna have dinner like a quarter horse.
How was it?
That was awesome. Oh man, that was great. That views were outstanding.
And what are you doing today?
Well, today Mike and I are going to move the PMM, which is the big module that's currently in Payload Bay of Discovery, over to the station, and that will complete the assembly of the ISS.
You guys ready? Here we go. Woohoo! Yeehaw!
Hey Nicole, I hate to ring the recess bell on you, but we only got about 15 minutes left before an extended LOS, and we have a Liz here for the transfer brief before hatches close.
My wallet is off the trap and in my hand.
We're doing really well. They've been following instructions exceptionally well today as I boss them around.
here. We appreciate your hospitality. We appreciate you putting up with us, knocking your stuff off the walls, and generally trashing your station. And we're gonna miss you guys. And so thanks for everything. We're gonna miss you, but most of all, we're gonna miss Discovery. We wish her fair winds and following seas. Thank you.
Discovery departing. We'll miss you guys.
I've taken walks by the rolling sea, where the cliffs drop down to meet the big blue deep. I breathed in the air that rolls over these hills. I breathed it in, but I've had my fill. I gotta roll away. May I return to this island someday. Roll away. Maybe I'll
Discovery, you are on energy approaching the hack. Latest winds now 17 peak 25 out of 150, so it's straight down the runway. We ran the energy numbers with the higher peak wind that we gave you earlier, which was the 18 peak 28, still getting you 2,200 feet down. So we'll call it the 2,100 at 195.
Okay, copy that. You're flying. Thank you. Good job. Bring it on, boys and girls. Roger that. I see one. I see two. Roger. I see them both. Good. Going into the clouds.
We agree you are on, and we have good HUD video.
Very good. 600, 500, 400. Here's down. Now you're 4230, 2220, 10, 505. Okay, shoot. 010. Okay, 1, 2, get ready. There's a shoot. Yeah. Those gears down. Yeah. That speed enabled. All right, backing it up. Here comes the sun. Now get the shoot on time. 99. Nice job, Steve. Yeah, beautiful. 85. Yeah, the winds are just really. Is coming now. Okay. Coming on brakes. I thought we'd shoot. Yeah, I'm not. I have to. I'm easing off. I'm not hardly touching it. Okay. 49. Nice job. Straight.
Oh, I love this place, my breath and my bones, and I'll always call this island my home. But I know when the day comes, when my farewell.
And Houston Discovery for the final time. We'll stop.
Discovery Houston, Pinto, great job by you and your crew. That was a great landing in tough conditions, and it was an awesome dock mission that you all had. You were able to take Discovery up to a full 365 days of actual time on orbit. I think that you call that a fleet leader and a leader of any manned vehicle for time in orbit. So, job well done.
Okay, copy that. Of course, we're headed to 5-3, and I'd like to thank you and your team and all the orbit team for a fantastic mission, as well as the Expedition 26 team on orbit. And I'd also like to thank KFC, who has given us a perfect vehicle from start to finish on her final flight.
Let me switch here. And that's what we looked like after the mission. Kind of tired. But anyway, so that was my last 2 week camping trip to space. And so I think that's pretty much all I have for you, but I'd like to open up for, if we have time, for questions and answers. Do we have time? I think we do. Yes, sir.
Steve, give me 3 reasons why the United States and its partners in space exploration should continue with their missions going forward.
3 reasons why. I feel like I'm testifying before Congress, which I've done, by the way. It's not that much fun. 3 reasons. Well, I think, first of all, I think exploration is in our blood, and I'm talking about the U.S. now. You know, from the very beginning of the space program, it's inspired a lot of people. When you do exploration, like we're trying to do like now, going to the moon, and by the way, I'm working on that program as well, in addition to Dream Chaser, we're going to Mars. When you reach for something that's really, really hard to do technically, you have to challenge yourself, you have to come up with new ways of doing things, and by grasping after a goal that's so far out there that you don't think it's achievable, you're forced to make breakthroughs. Just like, you know, if you look at this museum that represents the World War II and specifically the gliders of World War II, look at all the advances that occurred out of necessity because we had to survive this war, we had to. And you can see some of these leaps in advancement just if you walk around this museum itself. And so I think that's true of space, and I think that's why we need to keep doing it. This country was founded and built on gain in all areas and leaps and the creativity of people. And by giving people challenges, you make them creative. Second reason, International Space Station. We have 16 countries involved in the International Space Station. Over the time we've been working with Russia, and by the way, when I graduated from Reese and I went and I was trained as a combat pilot, it was the middle of the Cold War. And we were trained to fight the Third World War against the Soviet Union. So, quick story. My first flight, STS-87, we had a Ukrainian astronaut on board by the name of Leonid Katanyuk, who was a Soviet cosmonaut, but he was also a Soviet fighter pilot and a Soviet test pilot before the wall came down. Well, they were our sworn enemies, and if you'd have told me back in 1983-84 that a little over 10 years from now, the Russians would be our friends, I'd be flying in space with them, I would have told you were crazy. But that's what happened. And so one night, about a month before launch, my commander on my first flight, I was the pilot, was an F-111 pilot. And Leonid Katanyuk was a MiG pilot. And we were looking at a map of the world one night. We're down at Kennedy Space Center, and Leonid pointed at this base. He said, "This is where I was stationed when I was flying MiG-21s, and this is when I was there." Kevin Kriegel, my commander, was stationed at Lakenheath in England flying F-111s. And when Leonid pointed that out, Kevin got this look on his face, and he said, "Leonid, one of the things we did when we were operational pilots is we had our first couple of missions already planned out. You guys may not know this, but we actually certified on very specific missions so that when the Third World War started, we already had planned and were ready to execute our first missions." Well, he flew 111s. They had a nuclear weapon mission, and should that be called on, the certification targets that Kevin was certified on, guess what his target was? It was Leonid's base. And had the Third World War kicked off, his job would have been to blow up Leonid's base where Leonid was. And we were all, the three of us were just, it was late at night, just kind of looking at each other and wow, has the world changed? But what I find in space, on the space station, is you have all these countries, and we work with Russia all the time, and U.S. has their ups and downs with Russia, but throughout all those ups and downs, the whole time I was in a space program, our relationship with Russia in space may remain constant. It's by far the best relationship to this day that this country has with Russia. And my contention is, since anything we do in the future is going to be international in nature, it's really hard to fight with people when you're working with them that closely in space. And so I think for the whole world, doing international ventures like this that are peaceful in nature helps the whole world to be a better place. Was that 2 or 3? I got to come up with a third one? Because space is really fun, and it's the only thing, it's the only thing I know how to do. And so, if we didn't have a space program, what would I fly? It's a pretty weak reason, but I'll come up with a better third one. But I got to think about it. Does anybody else have any questions that are not as hard as that one? Yes, sir.
Steve, from your personal experience, how was it flying with John?
Oh well. So on my second flight, if you remember the flight when John Glenn went back up into space, I was a pilot on that flight, and I never expected to be assigned to that flight because I'd just gotten back from my first flight. There was no way I was going to be assigned. I remember joking with my wife, like on a Sunday afternoon, and said, that flight, when that gets us assigned, those guys, they're going to have a lot of extra stuff they got to do, a lot of attention. The public, the world's going to be looking at them, and I remember telling my wife, I said, I'm glad that I'm not going to be on that. There's no way I'm going to be on that. And then that night, I ran into the chief of the astronaut office who said, hey, Steve, you're going to fly that mission. So anyway, so I didn't expect to be on it, but I got to know John and Annie, his wife, and his family, and John's the kind of guy you wanted to live next door to. You know, he'd left the space program. He'd been out for 36 years. He'd been a senator for 24 years, and he came back into the program like he never left it. I flew airplanes with him. He was a fantastic pilot at 77. On that particular mission, we actually had about 85 science experiments, and by the way, we were actually the predecessor mission to STS-107, the Columbia mission. They took a lot of the experiments that we did and flew them and took them to the next level of science on their mission. So most of what Rick and Willie and those guys flew, payloads I was already familiar with because I'd flown them on the previous flight. Anyway, but he came back to the program, and because we had 85 experiments and we had so much work to do, besides doing his own program, which was kind of studying aging in space, we actually assigned up to a whole bunch of other experiments to work on and train on because we needed the help, and he was fully capable of doing that help. One quick story on John Glenn. For those of you who don't know, when he went up in 1962, back when I was in diapers, in those days we didn't have a bunch of satellites up. They didn't have satellite communications. We didn't have a continuous comm. They had a series of ground stations, and he was going to go up in that first orbit, and a lot of his orbits he would be out of contact. And so the city of Perth, Australia, which is on the west coast of Australia, decided that they knew his ground track, they knew when he was going to fly over Perth, they decided to turn on every light in the city when he went up so that he'd see that. And so he flew over in 1962 and saw the entire city lit up of Perth. And so it was a great thing. It was a big media thing about it at the time. Well, when they found out he was going to fly again, the city of Perth decided to do it again for us on the STS-95. So it was going to occur early in the flight, about 4 hours into the flight, and we knew Perth was going to turn on all their lights again. And so we're coming up to Western Australia, and it's about 4 hours into flight, and Kurt Brown and myself, who's the commander, and myself, the pilot. So we're looking at the windows, and we're trying to find Perth. And John's, I think he was downstairs doing something. We were going to pull him up as soon as we saw Perth so he could see Perth again. And so we're looking, I can see the west coast of Australia coming. And keep in mind, you're moving at 5 miles a second, so you don't have a lot of time to find this. And I'm looking out, and I can see the coast of Australia approaching. It's pitch black, but I can see the coast, and I can see that it's covered in clouds. And it looks like the whole continent's covered in clouds. And think, oh no, it's going to be, we're not going to be able to see anything. Well, at the last minute, there it appeared, and there was a hole in the clouds just over Perth. And so I yelled down, John, come here, I got it. And so he comes floating up the flight deck. And my memory of that time was, I wasn't looking at Perth, I wasn't looking out the window. What I was watching John see Perth again 36 years later. And that's a memory I'll never forget. And I think his comment to me was, Perth's a lot bigger than the last time I saw it from up here. But it was wonderful to fly with John. He was a great friend. He'd call my youngest daughter on her birthday and stuff like that. And of course, Annie, his wife, was a sweetheart. And so, he passed away last year, and he'll be missed. But he was a great man.
Now, of all the hours you flew in space, how much time were you actually in a pressurized space?
The only time we were in the pressurized spacesuit was during ascent and entry. So we'd get in the suit about 3.5 hours prior to launch, and then all the way through launch. Once we got in orbit, we did a circularization burn to get us to a stable orbit, and then we did a whole bunch of work like opening the payload bay doors and make sure the vehicle was healthy. As soon as the vehicle was healthy, and that was about 2.5 hours into flight, then we'd jump out of our suits. And then we wouldn't put them on again until about 3 hours or so prior to doing the deorbit burn and doing the entry. So it's really, those suits are actually, the orange suits are only designed to 100,000 feet. So they're just to protect against a cabin leak, basically. The white suits that they went out and do EVA are designed for a vacuum, and obviously they wear those when they go outside. So other than that, we were in shirt sleeves.
Did you as a pilot ever go outside?
I didn't, and the way the program worked is generally the pilots and commanders. We had two types of astronauts back in the shuttle program. We had pilots and mission specialists, and so the pilots flew in the right and the left seat. Like Willie and Rick were both pilots. After you flew pilot once or twice, then you would upgrade to commander. So Rick was the commander, Willie was the pilot on his first flight, Rick was on his second flight as commander. Then the mission specialists were the ones that typically did the spacewalks, and they would kind of train on a different curriculum in parallel while we did a lot of ascent and entry and emergency training. We always told the mission specialists the reason that we stay inside and they go out the door is because they're expendable and we're not. So, but we were all secretly jealous of them, truthfully. All the way in the back.
Curious, how many people are in each annual astronaut class?
So, you mean like in astronaut selections?
Well, you were talking about, you were in one.
Oh, yes, yes. So the size of the classes really vary. Back in the shuttle days, like Rick and my class, we were about 19, and they didn't select into a class every year. They selected classes usually every 3 or 4 years. So we had about 19 in our class. Willie's class, when they came in, they were a huge class, and the reason being is we were ramping up to build space station at the time, and we thought there were going to be a lot more missions, as is usually the case. That slipped, and so they actually ended up a bigger class than we really needed. So a lot of those folks waited a long time to fly. But Willie's class had 35 plus another 9 international astronauts in it. So when I was running the office, we had about 120 U.S. astronauts, and then I had probably another 20 or 30 international astronauts in the office at any one time. Now, since we're just doing space station missions, and we typically only fly about 3 or 4 crew members a year, the astronaut office has gone from where it peaked out, which is probably 140, to about, I think they're running about 40 now, something like that, 40 total. Yes?
Sir, you work for a private company, and SpaceX has done amazing things. How does that impact relevance in NASA?
Well, SpaceX is, for those of you who haven't heard of SpaceX, Elon Musk is the guy that started that company. They build rockets. They have contracts with NASA also. They're part of the crew program, and they're also doing cargo just like we are. The interesting thing about SpaceX and companies like that is they've really lowered the cost of launching rockets, and 80 to 90% of our cost flying this, if we want to commercialize it, is the cost of the rocket to launch us. And so what Elon's doing is he's totally disrupting that market. And so you can go to space for a third of what you could go to space before, and as long as that continues and he's successful, every other rocket company in the world, by the way, is now redesigning their rockets to compete against Elon. And all that is great for us because the cheaper we can get to orbit, the more likelihood we'll be able to commercialize this and commercialize low Earth orbit, which is one of our goals. Because NASA wants to go explore. We don't want to have the same problem we had last time where we couldn't afford to explore and operate space station. In the future, if NASA's can explore and go back to the moon, which is what they want to do, and eventually to Mars, they have to get out of the low Earth orbit business, which means what you really need is a commercial space station in the future. But these launchers, like what Elon's doing, is going to enable that if he's successful. So it's good for us. I wish him all the success in the world. We also do compete against him, so I really like what he's doing, and then I also can't stand him. So, I feel strongly both ways because he competes against us. So, in the back. What does zero gravity feel like? That's an excellent question. You know what it feels like. You just don't realize you do. So, you ready for my stupid physics lesson of the night? All right. Do I have any physics professors in here before I do this? Okay. All right. So, now, kids, you have to answer these questions when I do it. So I got this piece of paper in my hand, and I'm going to release it. What's it going to do? What? Is it going to fall to the ground? Sure enough. Why did it fall to the ground? Because of gravity. All right, here's my first hint to you. Whenever I ask you why did it fall, the answer is always going to be gravity, okay? But I'm going to try to fake you out, so we'll just watch it. So now, I take the same piece of paper, and I throw it again, except I'm going to throw it forward. What does it do?
It goes forward a little, but then it falls.
Why does it fall?
Because it's gravity.
Right. All right. You adults, are you following along? You guys getting this? All right. All right, now, let's say I'm a Major League Baseball player, which I always wanted to be, but except for drive and talent and athletic ability, I would have been one. So, I'm going to throw this 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Do you think I can throw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball? No. Oh, well, then I'm done. I'm leaving. No. So, I throw this 100-mile-an-hour fastball. That was almost 100. What did it do? It went forward, right? But what did it do? Why did it fall? All right, you guys are doing good. All right, most audiences don't keep along this long. So you guys are doing good. Okay, so now let's say I took this same piece of paper, and let's say I could throw it at 5,000 miles an hour. I threw it due east, 5,000 miles an hour. What would it do? So would it fall? Why? Right. Except it'd probably land, somewhere on the east coast of the United States. It'd probably go 3,000 miles forward or something like that. So now, last question is, I take this piece of paper and imagine I can throw it at 17,500 miles an hour. What's it going to do? You're smart. That was a good answer. Yeah. If I throw it perfectly at 17,500 miles an hour, it's going to go all the way around the world and probably hit me in the back of the head if I do it just right. But, is it falling? What did I tell you the right answer was? So was it falling? Yes. Why was it falling? All right. I just explained to you what it's like to go into orbit, and now you're going to know what it feels like. So everybody thinks to get into orbit or get into space, you go straight up. That's not true. It's not about altitude. If I go 1,000 miles straight up, as soon as I cut off my engine, I'm going to come 1,000 miles straight down. The whole key to getting to orbit is speed. And the way it works is, if you get enough forward speed, the gravity of the Earth is going to continue to pull you toward the Earth. But if you get going fast enough forward, instead of falling back and hitting the Earth, you're going to fall all the way around the Earth. And that's why that piece of paper, when I threw it at 17,500 miles an hour, came around and hit me in the back of the head. That's how you get into orbit, and that's what it sustains. And that's why people call it free fall. So zero gravity is not zero gravity at all. It's really free fall, because you're falling around the Earth. And so to get to speed, when you see the shuttle take off, it looks like we're going vertical. We go vertical until we get it out of the atmosphere, and then we go horizontal and accelerate for speed. In fact, we descend during ascent to get speed. And so what it feels like is just like if you're falling. So how many of you have traveled over a country road? You got country roads out here, and you go over a bump really fast? You ever get that butterfly feeling in your stomach? Where that comes from is, or a roller coaster going over a hill real quick, when you go over those bumps, when you're going down the back side, you're falling. And so what it feels like to be in space is that butterfly feeling continually. And that's what it feels like to be in space. And every one of you knows what that feels like. And so that's all it is. That's all there is to it. So I just taught you physics loosely. All right. Yes, ma'am. Why are the wings, you mean up at an angle? So what I didn't tell you is the Dream Chaser is actually a lifting body. And what that means is most of the lift that vehicle produces is from the body of the vehicle and not the wings. The reason the wings are up like this is because if they were down horizontal, too far out, they get too hot during entry and they'll burn off. And so they're up because what we want to do is we have to come in as a blunt body, so the temperatures on the leading edge of the vehicle, which by the way still go to 3,000 degrees, are much lower. And so it helps us with the being able to enter. So when you think about something like the space shuttle or our vehicle, it's got to do three things at the same time, right? It has to be like a rocket going up into space. It has to act as an orbital laboratory or a docking platform or a maneuverable vehicle to dock with space station or grab a satellite or something like that. And then it's got to enter like a capsule does through extreme heating, and then it has to land like an airplane. But to do that, to do all four of those things safely and successfully, you have to compromise in every area. And so that's why the wings are up. It doesn't really, just like the space shuttle, this glider here glides way better than the space shuttle does. And so I used to tell people the space shuttle and our Dream Chaser, they don't really glide. They do more like, if you ever seen the Buzz Lightyear cartoon, they do more like falling with style. So, and then you get enough energy on them and you pull back at the last minute, bleed off a lot of energy, and land it. What else? Yes, sir. Any chance I'm going to get to fly Dream Chaser? When we were doing actually I got really surprised when I went and interviewed with them for that, because they said, hey, if we get the crewed version going, will you fly it? And I'm like, well, it never occurred to me. I didn't even think about it. And what I told them at the time, I said, when it comes time to fly it, if I'm the most qualified to fly it and the right person to fly it, then I will. However, what I didn't tell them is that if I actually go fly again after doing this 5 times, my family will kill me. And so, in all seriousness, obviously the 5 shuttle flights I flew, and particularly with the risks associated with it, the families have a much, much more difficult time with those than we do. And so I put my family through it 5 times, and I don't think I can do it again. And I'll be too old anyway. So.
Third answer.
What's that?
Have you figured out the third answer yet?
No, I haven't been thinking about your question. How long does it take? That's a great question. How long does it take to get from the launch pad on Earth to space? What do you think? You have a guess? 1 day. It's quicker than that. You want to try another guess? 79 hours. Anybody? What do you think? 5. You're the closest. It's actually 8.5 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm so slow. I wish we could do it in 5 minutes, but it's 8.5 minutes. So yeah, 8.5 minutes from a standing start to 17,500 miles an hour. So it's a pretty quick ride. It takes about an hour to come home. Yes, sir. How does what? Oh, that's so. He asked, how long does it feel like? For me, actually, my first flight, it felt like a lot quicker than 8.5 minutes. When we launched, I was used to flying fighters that had a lot of power and could climb straight up and accelerate, but nothing like a rocket. I felt like I was on a runaway freight train on that first flight, and I felt way behind the aircraft or the spacecraft all the way to orbit. As I flew subsequent flights, I got used to it, and then by the end, 8.5 minutes felt like 8.5 minutes. But first time I flew, that 8.5 minutes felt like about 20 seconds. So, yes, sir.
At the end of a mission, how long would it take you to get your land legs back?
So that's an interesting question. After a couple weeks in space, and the long duration folks, for the folks that were up there for 6 months, took them a lot longer. But when you come in and you enter the G field again, and you start having gravity on you, it makes you pretty dizzy, and you have to and since the flying of the shuttle to land it is all manual, I had to fight that dizziness and try to get over as much of that as possible before I took the stick to fly. But typically, coming back, that dizziness would last for about a day or so after landing, and then I'd be recovered from it. And it varied by individual. I usually was able to battle through it pretty quickly. Yes, sir.
Is the re-entry tile the same as it was early on?
So, early on, like if you look at the capsules, like Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, they actually used what's called an ablative heat shield. And what it would do is it would burn, it would form a char layer, and that char layer would insulate the rest of the heat shield from the entry. But they were running higher temperatures, 4,000 degrees or so. The shuttle uses a tile material. It's mostly made of air and very lightweight tile that dissipates the heat. And then on the leading edges of the space shuttle, you have what's called reinforced carbon-carbon, which could take the higher temperature of 3,000 degrees. And that was a reusable heat shield. For the vehicle I'm working on now, we've essentially taken that shuttle technology, but we've, like one of the lessons learned was, that tile's pretty fragile. We're flying what we call Tuffy tile. So it's a much stronger tile designed to take damage. And then on our leading edge surfaces, we're using a different kind of tile that's much stronger than the reinforced carbon-carbon, which is where the Columbia got the hole in. And so we're not using that, we're using something much stronger than that. So the materials have improved over the years. We've made them much stronger. We understand them a lot better. But we still plan on a reusable shield. Now, the spacecraft that are coming in from the moon, instead of seeing 3,000 degrees, they're seeing 4,000 degrees, and that tile can't survive 4,000 degrees, so they're using an ablative heat shield just like the older vehicles are. The Soyuz actually uses, the Russian Soyuz capsule, it uses this kind of impregnated wood, believe it or not, as a heat shield. It's almost like a cork, and it's impregnated, but it works well. So, pretty low tech. Yes, sir. How many G's do you pull on takeoff? So for those of you who don't know what a G is, right now you're at 1 G. And so if you weigh 150 pounds and you're at 3 G's, you weigh 450 pounds. So in the space shuttle, we only pulled 3 G's during ascent on our back. And the reason being is we would actually throttle the engines down to maintain that 3 G's, because for space, it's all about how much mass can you get to orbit, how much weight can you get to orbit. And we could, if we let the engines run out at full speed all the way up to orbit, we'd be pulling 6, 7, 8 G's by the time we get to orbit. But to do that, you have to put a whole bunch of more structure on the vehicle, which means you can carry less payload. So just like I was talking about all those compromises you make, we actually throttle the engines back as we're climbing, as the vehicle gets lighter, as we burn fuel, to maintain 3 Gs so we can get more payload to orbit. And in fact, when the engines shut off when we get to orbit, we have those engines all the way back in idle power when we shut them down. Yes, sir. I'm sorry? What was my first mission? Oh, when was my first mission? It was in November of 1997. Probably before you were born, I'm guessing. Like long before you were born. So, yes, ma'am. What did I what? What did I eat? I ate food. Oh, you mean what kind of food? Oh, so we had a pretty extensive menu of mostly like freeze-dried kind of backpacking kind of food. We carried something called MREs, which are military rations also. And it was really, you'd like this part, but before every mission, we had a food laboratory, and they would prepare all the different kinds of food, and we'd get to do a taste test on it, and then we'd score all of it, and then we had to make our own menus for each meal. What do you want for this meal? And then the nutritionist would always check, I never picked vegetables, so they make me put vegetables on there and stuff like that. And then we carried that. But then when we were up on space station, we had U.S. food, and we also had Russian food, and then if we had like an Italian on board or a French astronaut or something, they would have food as well. So we like to go over and eat the Russian food or the French food or stuff like that. So the food is actually very good. Enjoyed it. Yes?
Speaking on that,
Yes?
French or Italians on the International Space Station. Did they have their wives with them?
No, they did not, unfortunately. No, and by law, we couldn't bring any alcohol on board, so they wanted to, and there's been discussions about them doing that, and they may be doing it now, I don't know, but at the time, no such luck. We did have fruit punch, though, which is a really poor substitute for a good French wine. So, yes? In zero G, did our bodies function differently? So, yeah, so when you got to zero G, a couple of interesting things happened. The first thing is, if you knew somebody on Earth and you see them when they get into space, their face looks different. Their face will look puffy, and the reason being is, when we're here on Earth, we have a lot of fluids, and gravity's kind of holding it down into our legs. And when you get up on orbit, you get what's called a fluid shift. And so all of that kind of shifts up, your face gets real puffy, until you get rid of that extra water. And it's a couple of quarts of water, it's a lot of water, and then eventually it kind of goes down a little bit, but you look a little bit different. So that's one of the first things that happens. And by the way, when you come back and enter, now you're a couple of quarts low. And so one of the things we did before we would come in and land is we would, what's called fluid load. And we would take, for me it was 48 ounces of water, within 15 minutes of doing the deorbit burn, within an hour of landing, with salt tablets to make sure I could retain that water, because as soon as you hit the gravity field, you need all that fluid. Otherwise, you're a couple quarts low. And early in the program, we had a lot of astronauts passing out on entry because of not doing that. So that's one of the effects. The other thing is, of course, this butterfly feeling you get, and it's permanent. My first flight, I remember about the first 24 hours, I felt like my head was at a 135-degree angle down all the time. And so it took a little getting used to it. Most astronauts, only about 30% get actively sick the first day or so. Usually nobody's real hungry the first day until you get used to it, because your internal organs kind of move around, but by about the second day, everybody's used to that. So you have to get used to that. So that's another change. The other thing that happens, which is really good for me because I'm not the tallest guy in the world, is you get into zero G and your spine actually stretches, and so you grow. And in fact, I measured myself one time, I grew 1.25 inches, which is a big deal when you're as short as I am. But unfortunately, when you come back to Earth, your spine compresses and you actually get shorter than when you started, and then you eventually expand out to where you were before you started. So it's only temporary, and unfortunately, everybody else grows 1.25 inches too. So I'm still not taller than the rest of those guys. Yes, sir.
Being a pilot, that first time that you go out and fly solo, it's an amazing thing. You're like in awe. What was your awe moment in all of your missions?
A lot. I had a lot of those. Probably the first one that I really remember solidly was my first flight. We would, if you ever watch a shuttle launch, we essentially did a roll and flew upside down, and that was for load relief off the wings. And so we fly at a negative angle of attack. And so you're flying upside down, but you're going straight up. And so you can't really see the Earth. You can't see anything except black sky. And so you're flying, but then at about 6 minutes, about Mach 12, Mach 13, and mine was the first flight to do this, you actually rolled a heads up, because we switched from communications with the ground to communications with the satellite, and we got to get our antennas oriented in the right way. So it's actually 6.5 minutes you do this roll. And so you're flying upside down, the computer's going to do the roll, and the computer is always going to pick the shortest direction to roll. And so since you're at 180 degrees, who knows which way the computer is going to decide to roll you. So, of course, my commander and I had a bet on which way it was going to roll. I wanted to roll my way. And whoever, by the way, if it rolls your way, then you get to see the Earth. If it doesn't roll your way, you don't get to see anything. And so, sure enough, it rolled my way. But my memory was seeing the Earth for the first time as I was rolling. I was obviously working, but I snuck a glance out the window as we were rolling, and seeing the Earth from space for the first time at about, like I said, about 6 minutes into flight was something I'll never forget what it looked like.
Yes, sir. Question, in long gravity. And then also, if we have somebody on the moon, we can get them back in 2-3 days. But on a trip to Mars, you're out. But how are we going to handle problems like infections, emerging infections, or cancers and such?
Yeah, so we've obviously done a lot of medical research, and the question is about how to handle the physiological and medical issues with long duration spaceflight. So there are several big concerns that NASA's working on. One was bone loss in zero gravity. The Russians on their space station, anecdotally, we don't have real data, but what we've kind of learned anecdotally is they had up to 30% bone loss in a 6-month mission for an individual. Well, that's pretty serious. If you translate that on a 6-9-month mission to Mars, you don't want your crew getting to Mars and breaking their legs when they step out. And it's very similar to osteoporosis, which is why we study that as well. What we found on space station, and I don't think they've published the results yet officially, but we put up a resistive exercise device like a weightlifting machine. We have crews do mandatory exercise every day, and what we're finding is crews are not only coming back stronger now, they're coming back with no bone loss. So I personally think we've got that one solved. The researchers may not agree with me, but I'm just a dumb pilot. I think we have it solved. But I don't know this. I don't understand the science behind it necessarily. The next big problem is radiation. When you get outside the space station, the space shuttle missions I flew, we were protected because we're inside the Van Allen belts. And the Van Allen belts protect you from a lot of cosmic radiation. Once you go outside of those, like if you're going to the moon or Mars or wherever, now you're exposed to a lot more radiation. So we have to figure that one out. We have to have good radiation protection. We also have to have a shelter. So if a solar flare heads their way, they have time to jump in a shelter. And we've, in fact, do that now on the space station. If a solar flare hits and it looks like it's going to come close, we actually put them in a more protected space on the space station. We actually have radiation protection in their sleep quarters on space station to protect them. And every one of us always flies with a dosimeter in our pocket, and they track our lifetime radiation. And so that's the radiation issue. The other things that are going on, there's something going on with people's eyes in long duration right now. That's probably what you were referring to. Right, exactly. And it has something to do with the back of the optic nerve and the pressures that you encounter in zero G. What we haven't been able to figure out, to my knowledge, is and it doesn't happen to everybody. I'm actually part of that study. And of course, I've only done short duration, but I don't have any effects of it. But I have a lot of friends that do, that have basically permanent degradation in their eyesight. And we don't know how it correlates genetically, or don't know how to measure for your predisposition to getting this. And that's a real problem, and we don't know how to solve that one, to my knowledge.
So far, not seeing it in women, which is interesting.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Okay. Yeah, actually everybody I know that's had that problem are men. So that's really interesting. So looks like women will have more opportunities in the future than men to fly if we don't figure this out. So yeah, so those are some of the problems. There's a lot of problems. We bring big medical kits, but if you're a long ways away, you're going to have to fix yourself if you're out there. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay? Okay. Yes, sir. All the way in the back. So, you guys hear the question? So if the window breaks in the spaceship, is there any chance of survival, or are you 100% going to die? I'll start out answering the question. Everybody dies eventually, right? But no. The space shuttle, for example, was designed to handle up to a quarter-inch hole. And then essentially what happened is, if we had a cabin leak up to a quarter-inch size hole, we had enough of nitrogen and oxygen on board to feed that leak to keep enough pressure to allow us to get back in those pressure suits and get home before all the air leaked out. But we had a certain amount of time to do it. So if we had a cabin leak, we had to figure out where it was. We'd isolate it if we could. If we couldn't isolate it, then we'd feed this leak, get in our suits, deorbit burn, get the vehicle down into the atmosphere as soon as possible. So we were good up to quarter-inch leak. Now, if you take a big hit that blows out a whole window, it'll be, you'll go into a vacuum very quickly, and you can't survive that. So But we take a lot of precautions. The windows on the space shuttle and also on our Dream Chaser, we actually have 3 different window panes with thermal barriers and barriers in between. So what we do on those vehicles is we make them very redundant. What that means is we have, for example, the way the space shuttle was designed was something called fail-ops, fail-safe. So you could take an entire system failure and continue the mission. You could take a second system's failure of the same exact system and still get home. And so you made the vehicle very redundant and safe, much like they do with airliners.
Steve, since we have some time, could you go into some of the problems and the timelines on manned Mars mission?
Some of the problems, and well, you guys are hard. Problems and timelines on a manned Mars mission. The biggest issue, I think, with a Mars mission is the amount of time to get there. Right now, the plan is to use chemical propulsion to get to Mars, and the one-way trip to Mars is roughly 9 months. Mars and Earth's closest approach occurs every 2 years. And so if you do the timing, and you want to do a Mars mission, and you want it to be as close as possible, and that's what it takes to get it done in 9 months, then you fly all the way to Mars, you can spend 1 month on the surface, then you better fly all the way back. Or you wait a year and 1 month on the surface and then come back. To me, the biggest challenge with going to Mars, besides all the physiological and those sorts of things, is logistics. Because if you're gonna send people to Mars, then you have to carry enough food and water and supplies to keep them alive for 2 years minimum, maybe longer than that. And that's a lot of supplies. That's a lot of logistics. Keeping space station going with 6 people on board, it takes a lot of resupply vehicles, and we're one of them, but we're only one of 3 actually one of 5 different resupply vehicles just to keep space station operating. So that's one of the big challenges. The redundancy is a big challenge. You want to protect the crew if something goes wrong. Do you put an additional vehicle up there, a second vehicle, things like that. My personal belief about Mars missions, and the moon's different. We can go to the moon, it's only 250,000 miles. But Mars being 20, 30 million miles, I don't think personally that chemical propulsion is the way to get to Mars. So we have a gentleman that was in the astronaut office, who's a physicist, a guy by the name of Franklin Chang Diaz, he's an interesting story. He was born in Costa Rica, couldn't speak any English, came to this country when he was a senior in high school because he wanted to be an astronaut. And he couldn't speak any English, went to his senior high school here, started out the first semester flunking all of his classes, ended up getting A's in all of his classes by the end of the year, ended up at MIT and PhD, and he's created something called a Vyazmir rocket, and it's actually a rocket that uses a lot of electrical power to take an inert gas, heat it up to millions of degrees, create an electromagnetic field that becomes like a nozzle, and it fires this plasma through this nozzle, and basically with about 10 megawatts of energy, he can do the Earth to Mars transit in about 39 days. And now it's a technology he's working on. He's doing ground testing. They were supposed to put a demo on space station, I think, last year. I'm not sure how he's doing with it, but something like that, I think, is the key. So I think really the key, which would solve your logistic problems, your radiation problems, your medical problems, is speed. And so this is just Steve talking. It's not NASA's position, but that's my position. I think if we're really going to go to Mars, we need to go invest in that, something like that. Yes, sir.
Does your heat come from nuclear fission, or what's your source of?
I think for that particular thing, unless we have solar arrays that are at 80 or 90% efficiency, you would have to go with nuclear power. And that's one of the hangups, right? Nobody wants to, but it would really, the amount of power you need is equivalent of a nuclear reactor in a submarine. It's not that much. But everybody's got to get over the idea of launching a nuclear reactor into space. And I don't think the world's there yet. Maybe they will someday. Yes, sir.
Do you maintain a college license to fly small?
Yes, I do. I still fly, not as much as I'd like. Up in Colorado, I fly with the Civil Air Patrol. And so we do, if you haven't heard of Civil Air Patrol, they're like an Air Force auxiliary, and we fly little Cessnas, and we teach, my favorite part, we teach like junior high kids how to fly, high school kids. We also do have a search and rescue mission for missing hikers and downed airplanes. We do fire watch up there. We send airplanes and crews down to Houston for the floods to do work down there, and so it's a volunteer organization. So I fly with them. I fly a little bit on the side as well, but not as much as I'd like to. What I need is an airplane, and I need one of you or all of you to convince my wife to let me have one. So that's my real problem. Yes, ma'am. Why do I what? Why do I want to go to Mars? Why do we want to go to Mars? I think the biggest driver for going to Mars is we think that's the most likely place in the solar system closest to us that may have had life at one time. They've obviously found a lot of water on Mars, a lot of questions about Mars, learning how our own Earth was created. We think we can learn from Mars. So that's really the driver for Mars, is they believe there's a chance we could, if not find life there today, find evidence of life in the past. And that's the big driver for Mars. All right, I think I've punished you.
Say that it's just because that's what's next. We've been to the moon.
Yeah, we've been to the moon, and maybe it's the next great destination. It's kind of like, how many places in the world haven't I been to? A whole bunch. How many of those places do I want to go to? All of them. So that's part of it. But I think the everybody's always focused on Mars because of the life question. So. All right, I think I have punished you enough. So I think I'm all done, so thank you very much.